Where the leader of the free world moves, all things grind to a halt to allow safe passage. Or at least, that's the plan. And in the bustling ecosystem that surrounds the highest executive of the United States of America, making sure presidential travel goes to plan is amongst the highest responsibilities a person could be charged with. In this ultra-important role, protecting the VIP to end all VIPs, success or failure can have staggering implications, and the penalty for failure in the worst-case scenario is nothing short of the demise of the most powerful person on Earth. So today on Mega Projects, we're going to dive into all the planes, trains, and automobiles that enable America's highest office to function. We'll be peering behind the curtains, just how this whole system works, and we'll take a close look at the real-life stakes of success or failure in a precise and careful dance that just can't go wrong. When it comes to presidential transport, no single car, helicopter, or ship could ever come close to the reputation of Air Force One. The centerpiece of America's presidential fleet, Air Force One is widely regarded as the gold standard of transport that any national leader could hope to match. Before we can understand the aircraft that is Air Force One, though, we've got to understand what Air Force One actually is. It's not an aircraft, it's a designation. It's common parlance across all spheres of the US military, referring to any and all aircraft if the president, and thus the military's commander-in-chief, is on board. For example, if the president were to take a flight on a US Army Black Hawk helicopter, then that helicopter is now designated Army One. If the president flies on a Coast Guard HC-144 to watch a search and rescue mission in action, then that's Coast Guard One. If the president would strap into a space capsule and take a voyage to low Earth orbit, then that capsule will be called Space Force One. If the president is flying civilian for whatever reason, that craft is designated Executive One. And even if the president is taking a flight in an Air Force aircraft that isn't one of the iconic 747s so tied to the Air Force One designation, then whatever aircraft the president is in will assume that title. No matter the aircraft, the message is the same. All operations, all aircraft, all flight control centers, and whatever else all defer immediately to the president. Then there are the two planes we most commonly think of as Air Force One, a pair of extensively modified and customized Boeing 747-200B aircraft designated with the US Air Force as the VC-25A. Clocking in at a maximum takeoff weight of 833,000 pounds, or roughly 378 metric tons, and powered by 4 General Electric CF6 series turbofan engines generating some very impressive thrust, the two aircraft are each served by crews of 26, a flight crew including a pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and navigator, and other elements including a cabin crew, an onboard maintenance team, and more. Stretching just a hair under 232 feet with a wingspan of 196 feet, the VC-25A is able to hit top speeds of 630 miles per hour, 1,014 kilometers per hour, at its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. At cruising speeds, it can fly for a range of 7,800 miles if need be without refueling, and it can fly at a service ceiling of up to 45,100 feet, that's 13,700 meters. Inside the aircraft, the layout walks a fine line between utilitarianism and presidential elegance, with all the trappings that befit a major world leader crammed and tucked away into every conceivable configuration. Equipped with two main decks, the VC-25As are constructed in a way that reserves essential functions to the uppermost floor and pushes most storage capacity into the aircraft's underbelly. The main floor is meant nearly completely to facilitate presidential duties, with 4,000 square feet set up for the benefit of the high executive. On board is an executive suite for the president, including 2 couches with the option to convert into beds, alongside a private lavatory and shower, a vanity, a double sink, and a side office for work. After the terror attacks of 9/11, the office was equipped with the requisite technology to allow the president to address America from the onboard office. Also on board the aircraft is a conference room with a 50-inch plasma screen, an additional 18 televisions, office areas featuring some 87 telephones, and a medical annex with a fold-out operating table and a fully stocked pharmacy, as well as a treadmill. The pair of onboard galleys can feed up to 100 people simultaneously, while senior staff, security personnel, and special guests get their own quarters. In a rare touch for a passenger aircraft, the 747s include their own fold-down stairs at the front and aft, plus a fully self-contained baggage loading mechanism. News media sits at the back of the plane, and free movement around the aircraft is governed by a strict policy. Wherever a person is assigned within the plane, they may move anywhere rearward of that point as they please, but they may not travel further toward the forward section than wherever they've been assigned. Outside the aircraft, a good deal more happens outside the view of the president and other passengers. Air Force One is generally followed by a convoy, itself carrying the president's helicopter, the requisite vehicles to support the presidential motorcade, additional personnel, and a range of other equipment that Air Force One cannot hold by itself. In keeping with the plane's exceptionally high value as a strategic target for American adversaries, it's fitted out with a long list of known defensive measures, including anti-missile countermeasures, radar jamming countermeasures, and both flares and chaff to throw missiles off its tail. It's shielded against a nuclear electromagnetic pulse, it's set up to act as a mobile military command center, and it can receive aerial refueling, meaning that in the event of a crisis, or even just an extra long flight, it can stay in the air for far longer than the span of half a day or so that it would take to burn through its normal range. And those are just the extent of Air Force One's known capabilities. It's almost certainly got a whole lot more under the hood, but the true scope of what it can do is veiled underneath layer upon layer of classified protection. Whatever those capabilities are, they're likely to be rather comprehensive. For all the protective measures on board Air Force One, it typically does not fly with any fighter escort. And perhaps the aircraft's most important feature of all is its redundancy. Every element of the two VC-25As are built to be resilient if they should fail, from a specialized navigator on the flight team, filling a role that pilots are more than able to take over if need be, to a mechanical team sitting ready to service parts that rarely fail but could lead to catastrophe if they were ever compromised. Even the presence of two planes rather than one is a redundancy in itself. One of the aircraft can always be serviced while the other is kept on standby for flight. The aircraft are overseen by over 1,000-person team at the 89th Airlift Wing, based at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, who also handle airlifting duties for the Vice President, members of the presidential cabinet, foreign dignitaries, and other very high-priority VIPs. And when in flight, Air Force One is trailed by another plane that can take over its duties in the event of anything from inconvenience to catastrophe. The US maintains a small fleet of Boeing 757s fitted out to do the job of its larger counterpart and designates one as a follow plane anytime Air Force One flies. Purchased with a minimal paper trail and hidden in secrecy, they're different than the four 757s that the US does publicly use to service the Vice President and other high-ranking officials. These shadowy counterparts are believed to have the hardware on board to connect the president with America's nuclear arsenal, and they're known to have a similar but scaled-down interior fitting mimicking that of the typical Air Force One planes. The VC-25A was never meant to last forever, though, and already its replacement is very near to arrival. Slated for introduction in 2027 and 2028 respectively, the US Air Force has sourced two replacement aircraft for presidential flight, a pair of late-model Boeing 747-8 aircraft to be designated the VC-25B. These aircraft are a good bit larger than their predecessors, with a range improved by nearly 1,000 miles, and they're comparable in just about every other aspect of performance while emitting significantly less CO2. Although the process of getting them into service has been, well, not completely smooth, they're expected to take over in the next couple of years, and they'll likely carry onboard updates, bringing Air Force One fully into the 21st century. But Air Force One isn't the only airworthy tool in the president's transport tool bag. To find the other, we've got to take a closer look at those transport aircraft that we mentioned, flying behind Air Force One at all times with all the hardware the president and company could ask for. Among that hardware will be at least one in a series of helicopters designated Marine One. Like Air Force One, Marine One is a naming convention for any Marine Corps aircraft carrying the president around, but typically it refers to one of two sorts of aircraft currently in the employ of Marine Helicopter Squadron 1, the Nighthawks. The first helicopter, for consideration, is a vintage one by any standard. First flown in 1959, the Sikorsky SH-3 Sea King has been otherwise retired and replaced by the US military, but the presidency apparently has a soft spot for the things. Flyable at a top speed of 166 miles per hour or 267 kilometers per hour, a typical Sea King can fly at a range of 625 miles or a hair over 1,000 kilometers up to a service ceiling of 14,700 feet. The other helicopter in question is the White Hawk, a modified and specially designated version of the Black Hawk that provides a newer, faster, higher-ceiling alternative, albeit with reduced range. At this time, a fleet of over a dozen combined Sea Kings and White Hawks work to handle both the president and other high-level American executives. Despite being a somewhat lower-tech set of aircraft than Air Force One, the fleet of potential Marine One helicopters are the president's preferred method of covering short distances, given its logistical ease and relative safety when compared to a motorcade. Sometimes it's the way the president gets to and from Air Force One. Other times Air Force One will bring the president to a state, a region, or another country, and it'll be up to Marine One to do all the other ferrying about during a trip. Inside, it's fitted with basic conference tables, wood paneling, and seats for a handful of presidential guests. In terms of security, it's often flown in disguise despite its distinctive paint job. Rather than blending into the background, Marine One typically flies alongside up to 4 other aircraft from the same Marine unit, with the one holding the president not distinguished in any way. Those decoys, plus a constant shifting around in the helicopter's flight order, is usually enough to provide peace of mind, and all helicopters of the group are equipped with anti-missile countermeasures like flares and chaff. When it's time to be transported around, the helicopters are more than capable of being stuffed into a C-17 Globemaster or a C-5 Galaxy, showing up wherever the president is headed and waiting on standby in the event that they should be needed. Like Air Force One, the aging Marine One fleet has found itself up for replacement. In this case, duties will eventually be taken over by a specially developed military variant of the Sikorsky S-92, designated the VH-92 Patriot. Capable of flight at speeds of 190 miles per hour, that's 306 kilometers per hour, with a 620-mile range and a service ceiling of 14,000 feet, the base S-92 is capable of flying 14 passengers alongside a crew of 4, and by and large, it's an improvement on both aircraft that the Marine One fleet currently employs. But unfortunately, the program is way over budget and way behind schedule. Expected to procure a total of 23 helicopters when it was agreed on back in 2015, the program hasn't yet put a single chopper into presidential service nearly a decade later, and problems from communications equipment issues to dangerous exhaust and fuel leaks to concerns that the helicopter's rotors would burn the grass of the White House lawn have all come up. Now, unfortunately for all our fellow train nerds out there, it's far less common to find an American president riding the rails today than it used to be. Back in the day, presidents with names like Lincoln and Roosevelt were treated to bespoke rail cars as the height of luxury, roughly equivalent to the value that a massive private jet holds for today's presidents. With no nuclear launch codes to worry about, no devastating EMP bursts on the horizon, and not so much to worry about insofar as what we'd have to imagine would be called train interceptors, not really a thing, presidential trains were mostly used to conduct whistle-stop tours across America during campaign season. These days, between busy and sometimes under-repaired rail lines, a lack of adequate route protection for journeys hundreds of miles long, and the unfortunate reality that trains in America aren't much of a thing anymore, having a presidential rail car would probably be a bit much. But that doesn't mean that there's not anything close. What the presidency does have access to is a private railway car owned by a man in Florida named Jack Hurd. While it's not officially designated a piece of government property, the rail car has been a fixture for American presidents and presidential candidates, and it's gained a reputation as the train car that a president would use if they intended to do so. The rail car, named the Georgia 300, has carried George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and presidential candidate John Kerry, each of whom used it as part of their campaign duties. By all accounts, the rail car is quite nice to be inside of. A Pullman car dating to the year 1930, it's got a rear observation deck, plus an interior dining room, a lounge, a master bedroom, 2 extra bedrooms for the president's traveling companions, 2 shower-equipped bathrooms, a second lounge, a kitchen, and quarters for an onboard crew, all stuffed into just the single car. It's able to be slapped onto the back of most Amtrak trains and can travel on most track in the US. When it travels with the president on board, it's subject to all the same following entourages as Air Force One would be, albeit with a significantly modified Secret Service protocol to keep the track safe, especially at road crossings. Whether it too is equipped with anti-missile flares and chaff, we suppose we don't technically know, but we wouldn't recommend getting your hopes up. And thanks to some particularly recent history, there's one more informal addition to the list of presidential trains that bears discussion, and that would be Rail Force One, an informally nicknamed train used by President Joe Biden during an ultra-secret trip to Kyiv in Ukraine during the Eastern European nation's war with Russia. During this trip, Biden joined Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for a 400-mile train ride eastward from the Polish border, getting into Kyiv, making a quick tour, and getting the hell out before most of the world realized he was there. It was a rare instance of an American president traveling into areas where the US or allied nations had not secured the airspace, meaning that Air Force One, as well as the president's usual entourage, could not follow behind. Whether Rail Force One got any cover from overhead is impossible to say, but at least on board the train, Biden was known to be in a state of significantly lowered security relative to anything an American president would get in a normal situation. According to photos taken by an accompanying photographer, the accommodations were quite nice, including, at the very least, a pretty nice-looking conference room. And finally, we come to the Beast, the armored-up, tank-like limousine that American presidents rely on to get from place to place. Although presidential road vehicles trace their lineage to William Howard Taft's favorite steam car, from which he would spout a column of the stuff to hide himself from the press when need be, the newest iteration of the Beast are two models produced for the most recent few presidents, one introduced in 2001 and one in 2009, and the latest introduced in 2018. Each of those cars are operated by the Secret Service and referred to properly as Cadillac One. Well, with somewhere around 10 limousines in each line at a bare minimum, we assume you can guess the part that comes next. Cadillac One, or the Beast, is a moniker used to refer to whatever nightmare of a motor vehicle the president is riding in at a given moment. Despite some significant differences between the older and newer Beast cars, some things remain the same. Heavily armored and outfitted with thick doors, a nigh-on impenetrable chassis, and inches of bulletproof glass, the cars are believed to have their own internal air supply assigned to specific parts of the vehicle, so that if, say, the driver were compromised with a gas attack, the passengers inside could remain safe from the same toxin. Fitted with run-flat tires that can drive away even after being popped, the cars are understood to be exceptionally heavy and almost certainly feature underside armor to guard against mines and improvised explosive devices. Even in its older iterations, the Beast was an impressive piece of machinery, resilient to attack and able to fulfill any duty you could ask of it. But the newer generations, well, they take personal protection to another level. The 2009 iteration of the Beast got its first use in service to a president by giving Barack Obama his first drive as a president. On January 20th, 2009, the Beast drove Obama down Pennsylvania Avenue from the site of his inauguration to the site of his ensuing parade. A custom-built Cadillac, that version of the Beast wasn't based on any existing model from the manufacturer. Fitted with the kinds of wheels you'll typically see on heavy-duty trucks, it was estimated to weigh anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 pounds, that's 6,800 to 9,100 kilograms, with a relatively low top speed of just 60 miles per hour. But all that added weight was for a very good reason. In addition to its 5-inch thick glass and its hermetically sealed WMD-resistant interior, it carried a night vision optical display, a cannon to deploy tear gas, onboard reserves of oxygen, an armored fuel tank to guard against explosion, and, at the very least, some shotguns alongside suspected rocket-propelled grenades. Specifically trained Secret Service agents rode with the president at all times, and one would always be equipped with the materials and devices to diagnose and fix just about any problem that the Beast might encounter during a drive. Also on board were an encrypted satellite phone and a video system by which the president could conference in with the Situation Room, the Pentagon, overseas embassies, or a range of other US entities. All the while, its interior was finely manicured, and behind its bomb-resistant 8-inch thick doors, the president and any chosen ride-along buddies could enjoy a smooth drive at the height of luxury. Said one former presidential driver about what it felt like for Obama to drive inside, quoting here, "I think he will be surprised about how when he's in the limo, it's a cocoon. The everyday noises will be gone, and he will be totally isolated in this protective envelope. At the same time, I think he will be surprised at the communication capabilities, how the phones, the satellites, the internet, everything is at his fingertips." The price tag of each of Obama's dozen such cars, by the way, over $1 million. And as impressive as that version of the Beast was, it was just the beginning. The current presidential line of vehicles went into service in 2018, clocking in at a similar weight and a somewhat higher price tag than their predecessor. It includes all the bells and whistles of the prior vehicle, plus a bit extra, including extra supplies of blood in the same blood type as the president, and additional defensive measures like canisters enabling it to create smoke screens and oil slicks on the road. Its armor is enhanced, constructed from a combination of aluminium, steel, and ceramic, while its exterior walls have been beefed up to a thickness of 8 inches. It even features electrifiable door handles that can be activated to deliver potent electric shocks to people trying to force their way in. Its doors clock in at about the same weight as the doors of a Boeing 757. And as we'd be both remiss not to mention, and truthfully just sort of love saying, these are just the capabilities that we know about. Yes, even the latest edition of the Beast isn't the only machine responsible for presidential road travel. We've also got to talk about a far lesser-known device, the fleet of black armored buses referred to as Ground Force One. These are a new addition to the presidential arsenal as of 2011, replacing an older policy to charter and retrofit rented buses as needed for things like campaign tours. The new Ground Force One buses are specially designed, featuring 505 feet of space inside and equipped with exterior police-style blue and red lights. It's outfitted with all sorts of communications technology and is expected to include the hermetically sealed interior, the fire suppression systems, the presidential blood supply, and probably the onboard arsenal of the Beast as well, but by all accounts, it's otherwise quite unremarkable. Generally speaking, it's not pulled out too often, but when it is, it's yet another vital tool in getting the president from point A to point B. Just as important as the vehicles themselves are the presidential motorcade, a precise and very, very complete procession of vehicles that lead and follow the president's car wherever it may go. Presidential motorcades are a bit like, say, lobsters, in that they tend to grow and grow the older they get, and the modern presidential motorcade is a hell of an organism. It starts with the police escort, local or state cops driving ahead of the motorcade's intended route and shutting it down so that whether it's a single-lane back street or a 12-lane freeway, the motorcade has it all to itself with zero risk of attack or accident from other traffic. Then, more police lead the way, driving in formation, followed by the meat of the phalanx. Heavy sport utility vehicles under the command of the Secret Service. Inside are not just a mind-boggling number of agents with big guns and nice suits, but essential presidential staff, cars fitted to provide electronic countermeasures, a counter-assault team that can shield the president and organize an escape in the event of an attack, a hazmat team, press vans, at least one accompanying ambulance, and at times, even more of them. If the president is traveling in the Beast, then there won't be just one of the Cadillacs on the road. Instead, there will be 2 or even 3, making it so that even if a person with bad intentions lined up their shot at the president just right, they've got at best a 50-50 shot of even selecting the right car. With the complexity of organizing such an operation, it's not hard to understand the reality we noted earlier that typically the Secret Service will just use Marine One if they can. But their job often isn't so straightforward, and when it isn't, the motorcade answers the call. And finally, there's one last element to touch on when it comes to the president's motor vehicles, the way it ends its time in service. Every true beast has to have a fitting demise, and these ones are no different. And they end in what we can only describe as a Secret Service agent's best day ever, when the same organization that operates the beast attempts to destroy it by any means necessary. With small arms fire, sometimes heavier fire, and all the explosives their hearts could desire, the Secret Service sets to work testing the limits of the beast for one final time. In the process, they leave it a burned-out wreck and ensure that the secret technologies and layers of armor it held within its 8-inch walls are lost to history forever. Yet even with such an exhaustive list of luxurious fortress planes and nigh-on indestructible limousines, there's a whole other level to presidential travel that has little to do with physical hardware. Behind the scenes, the act of getting an American president someplace is akin to the act of moving a mountain, both in terms of the amount of heavy lifting that has to be done and the sheer manpower required to pull it off. The key players involved with that process are known as the Presidential Advance Team, and it's their job to work weeks, days, or mere hours ahead of a president to ensure that everything that could topple into the path of America's Commander-in-Chief is already dealt with by the time the presidential boots hit the ground. Rather than just one team, the Presidential Advance Team is an anthill, with various smaller teams preparing for individual trips, individual location visits, broad-scope logistics, and more. If a president were to take, say, a 1-week trip across 5 European cities, then it's on the advance team to send a small army of personnel to each of those cities, potentially even weeks in advance, in order to get every single element just right. This includes everything from protocols for high-level meetings and interactions, to minute-by-minute scheduling and travel itineraries, to personnel assignments, to making sure that after the president gets back to the hotel room after a long day of doing presidential things, the right flavor of Ben & Jerry's ice cream is waiting in the freezer. Alongside the White House team are the military and security factors that permeate every element of a presidential trip. This includes scoping out and locking down potential travel routes, planning for each vehicle in a motorcade, providing training or materials to local police to get them ready, and anticipating things like large crowds, hostile or adversarial locals, and much more. Presidential travel is typically planned to function as a sort of closed vessel. Anything the president might need on a trip that can't be picked up locally is going to be pre-packaged and included on the accompanying cargo planes or trucks, rather than waiting for the president to need or want that thing that isn't there. Cultural, religious, and political local sensitivities play a big part as well, not just in ensuring that a president is well-trained enough to not embarrass the United States by giving a kowtow when a handshake is more appropriate, but ensuring that the president's journey doesn't put America's highest executive in a place that would royally piss off a local population and make violence more likely. Every presidential quirk, oddity, preference, annoying little tendency, and possible whim must be accounted for, and every plan must be laid out not only with the requisite contingencies and backup plans, but with the expectation that with a wave of the hand and a harebrained idea, America's Commander-in-Chief has the authority to throw all of those plans straight out the window. And to some extent, that final note is the best way to express America's presidential travel system in a nutshell. It's highly unpredictable, it's incredibly complex. It requires the best aircraft, vehicles, and security teams that the US government can buy, and even then, it might still not be enough. It's a system, like any other, prone to failure and with constant and critical vulnerabilities lurking just below the surface, but that just makes it all the more important that at the end of the day, the system works flawlessly. America, and the president who holds its highest office, simply cannot abide anything less.